only thing which I would like to share with you is that he is here amongst us today, courtesy none other than our own Mr. Anil Nehru. He's a friend of his. They studied together and they connected after almost 30 years. 50 years. Then he shared with me that I have a friend, and how do you think about sharing his thoughts with the Chandigarh people? I said, why not? We happily accepted the suggestion given by Mr. Nehru, and it was very kind of Professor Atalay to have agreed to come all the way to deliver this lecture. We are indeed very thankful to you and Mrs. Atalay who have come over here. Once again, thank you so much. And one thing more, which he might feel embarrassed, but he has done us a great service. He's doing it all without charging a penny. We are not, neither his fare nor the usual fee, and he's staying with Mr. Nehru. So we are only offering him tea. Thank you so much, Professor Atalay.
Anil and Chan Nehru, I'm very, very grateful to. Anil, I looked for him for years, but he found me on Google 2 or 3 years ago, and we were able to reconnect. And when I had a chance to come to Phuket to give a talk next week, I thought that this was a great chance to make a stopover in India. And it's been overwhelming. We love it. Tomorrow, if the weather permits, we're going to go to visit his mother, who is 101 years old. And once you see her picture, you'll see how she hasn't aged at all. I think it'll find the computer again. In any event, in days when we were students at Georgetown University, I was frequently invited to their home, and there were many, many tidbits that I remember from those days, but one was that Mrs. Nehru, the senior Mrs. Nehru, Anil Nehru's mother, was a student at Oxford, as was Anil's father. She was from Hungary, and at one point she wrote to her parents that she had met and was seeing a young man from India named Nehru. Her family immediately wrote and said, "Cease and desist, one of them is in jail right now." Well, fortunately, she didn't. And the rest is history, as they say. I have 6 little grandchildren. They range in energy between 5 and 11. And the oldest of them, they're 2 11s, one of them from my son, the other from my daughter. The oldest of them, when she was 5, she saw me typing on my laptop at the kitchen counter, and she came over and she said, "Granddaddy, can we look at pbskids.org?" That's like well, it was obviously the internet, but the kids have to know so much more than we ever had to. And since it was Delilah asking me, I said, of course. I picked her up on my lap, and she said, "Granddaddy, we're going to look at the Chinese calendar," and asked me what my birthday was. I gave it to her. I said 6/10/40. And she put it in. And then she said, "You were born in the year of the dragon." I said, "Delilah, what does that mean?" She said, "Well, that means that you're nice to people and you're going to achieve a lot." And she said, "And you already have." This is a 5-year-old. I said, "What have I achieved?" She said, "You can draw, you know numbers, you're a professor, and you're old." In any event, when I give lectures, they're usually modeled, scaled for the group, and I know I'm speaking to an extremely intelligent group. I want to tell you a little bit about search for intelligent life in the universe. This will cross many borders, physics, mathematics, and art, but I was at a conference in 1978 in San Francisco. There's a famous hotel called the Fairmont. There were 400 scientists, and in one session, we were talking about the plausibility of extraterrestrial intelligence. Now, how many of you in this room believe that there is extraterrestrial intelligence? Okay. In that room, there were 80 people who voted, 14 Nobel Prize winners in the room, and about 80% of them voted that there was extraterrestrial intelligence. In fact, the question is not whether there's extraterrestrial intelligence, the question is whether there's terrestrial intelligence. We live very close to Washington, just an hour south of Washington, D.C. There's very little evidence of intelligent life in Washington. Well, but in 1978, when we had this conference, all we could do was play with the Drake 7-factor formula, a probability equation, and the Marx 9-factor formula. We know, for example, we live near a star, a G2 type of star that lives perhaps 10 billion years. It gives planets at a certain distance just the right climate to allow the chemistry to take place. Ours has been a successful laboratory. But in 1978, we didn't even know whether there was a single extrasolar planet, that is, a planet outside the solar system. Now we know of 400. The various orbiting telescopes have given compelling reason to believe that the universe is teeming with planets and most likely with the conditions for extraterrestrial intelligence. Well, I went up to a microphone to put in my 5 cents worth. Right in front of me was Israel's greatest scientist, Yuval Ne'eman, and right behind me were 2 Nobel Prize winners. One of them was Sir John Eccles from Australia. The other was Eugene Wigner from Princeton, my mentor and champion. And I wanted to sit down. I had nothing really to say, anything consequential at least. So I started pulling out, but Eccles, standing behind me, was holding my jacket. And he said, "Atalay, we want to hear a youthful opinion." Well, 32 years ago, I was certainly a lot more youthful and more opinionated, and I couldn't sit down. I had to listen to Yuval Ne'eman first and then add something. Yuval Ne'eman said, "In my country," he said, "we have a story. A woman goes to a doctor and says, 'I'm really worried. This is the 5th pregnancy.' The doctor says, 'You have nothing to worry about. You have excellent health. You have excellent history.' She says, 'You don't understand. This is number 5. Well, this goes back and forth until she gets so frustrated, she slams her fist down on his desk and she says, "You missed the point. According to statistics, every 5th child born is born Chinese." Now, this is certainly true. 21% of the population is Chinese, and another 20% is Indian. So he gave me the microphone and sat down, and I forgot what I got up to say in the first place. Fortunately, just a short time earlier, I was in Oxford sitting in a doctor's office waiting for him, and there was a copy of the British medical journal, The Lancet. And it started with, a woman goes to her doctor, she's pregnant for the 5th time, except it was a true story. And I'll let you vote on this because I asked that group of scientists also to vote. The woman is suffering from tuberculosis. The husband has a social disease. The first 4 children were born blind, stillborn, deaf and dumb, and the 4th one has tuberculosis. So who says in this group, have the child anyway? I see a few hands. Who says don't have the child? Suppose I tell you no hand means don't care. So who says have the child? Who says don't have the child? Okay. I voted not to have the child when I was reading the story. The child was born, it was Ludwig von Beethoven. I've worshipped Beethoven's music ever since I was a child, and I had terminated Beethoven. And everyone gasped. They also had terminated Beethoven. But right afterwards, Yuval Ne'eman came up to me and he said, "You don't understand," he said, "you're working with an anecdote and making statistics of it." I said, "Of course. So were you when you were talking about the Chinese baby." He said, "Try this one," he said. "The woman is pregnant for the first time. She tells the doctor she's married to a distant cousin. But it turns out it's not really a distant cousin. She's married to her uncle. It's the first baby. She's in her mid-40s. The husband is about 60. I won't ask you to vote on this, but the child is born again. This child is born. And this is Hitler, Adolf Hitler. So you've got to be careful with anecdotes, but they make The fourth story, I was going to make this series of tales of the fifth child, the prologue to Math and the Mona Lisa, my first book on Leonardo, and the publisher said it's a great story, but let's put it in the epilogue, not in the prologue. And when the epilogue came, he said, "It's a great story, but chapter 13 that precedes it is much better." So I decided to use it in the next book. Well, it didn't get into the next book either, but the third book it's going to get into, the next book. This is a 15-year-old girl gets pregnant with her boyfriend, who's 26. He's well-to-do, but marriage at that point is out of the question. It's a socioeconomic problem more than anything else. The child is born, and it's a love child or an illegitimate child, and this is Leonardo da Vinci. April the 15th, 1452. We really are not even sure where he was born, whether it was in Vinci or a village called Anciano, but we know the exact time. It was 3 hours after sunset. His grandfather, a notary, jotted it down. A son was born to my son. His name is Leonardo, spelled with an I. The first 5 years of his life, Leonardo lived with his mother. The next 10 years, he lived with his father, who came and took him, and since he was an illegitimate child, he didn't have the chance to become a notary like himself. And this is a great fortune for history and for the rest of us. Rather than being a very, very good notary, no doubt, he became this universal genius. He had no education, virtually no education. He was left-handed, and that meant sinister. He didn't have a first-grade education, so the teacher did not force the kids who were left-handed to write with their right hands. He taught himself, but he found it much easier to write backwards. Everything in Leonardo is backwards. You use a mirror to see the text. Was it because he was being secretive? Not at all. He didn't want to smudge the ink, because if you use your left hand to write towards the right, you smudge the ink. Also, the point of the pen, the quill, sticks into the paper. He was just being practical, and he could go much, much faster like that. I had a really ignominious beginning to my art and science career. My father was the military attaché to London, and he had to rent a nice large house that he could entertain in. We rented the house of Lord Curzon. Lord Curzon, in fact, had been the chancellor, the viceroy to India early in the 20th century. There were all these paintings in the house of the Curzon family. The one thing that I knew about Leonardo at 8, I had just had my birthday, I knew exactly. The one thing I knew was that Leonardo used to say the eyes are the windows to the soul. These paintings had no soul. They didn't speak to me. The family had just recently bought a bottle opener that would make very round pupils, and I went around opening all the eyes in these paintings. It was a disaster. No one really noticed it until one day the devil dressed as a diplomat came to visit my family, and my father related much later, the man raised his hand like this to shake my father's hand, but without stopping, he kept raising his hand, and he said, "Those paintings, they all have holes in the eyes. do you have a son? He had gotten to the culprit immediately, and only the devil could do that. My birthday present, a set of lead soldiers painted with lead paint, no doubt, were dumped into the furnace, and just about the time the furnace was replaced, the paintings were restored. It was a terrible, terrible beginning. 10 years later, I was at a school called St. Andrews in Delaware. My father was a military attaché there in Washington. And there, the father of a student came to give a talk about dynamic symmetry. He was an engineer who knew some mathematics, and he was sort of a part-time artist. And for the first time, I heard things that made connections for me. There were numbers and art. It wasn't painting by numbers, but there were symmetries in art that were astonishing. So after that, as I did my own art, I was always mindful of making these symmetries and proportions correct. And over the years, I realized what I was doing was what Leonardo had been doing 500 years earlier, but I was a product of an education, and he had absolutely none. He was inventing it all. Years later, still, I would give lectures on cruises when I could get away from the university in the summers, and a friend, an officer on a naval ship, started saying, "You've got to publish this. This has got to be published." Well, I always had intentions to do it, but it wasn't until 2000 when I was teaching a class, a graduate class called The Character of Physical Law. And there, I thought I had the chance when I saw students writing notes as fast and furiously as they could. We can probably turn the lights down somewhat, and this will show up a lot better. Is there a way of doing that? In any event, I had no idea I would be up till 2 or 3 every morning writing on my laptop. Finally, as I gave the notes to the students, I thought maybe I could give these to the publishers as well. And the Smithsonian and the Oxford University Press showed interest in publishing a book called The Two Leonardos. And indeed, there are 2 Leonardos I had in mind. But at that point, it was a double entendre. It had 2 meanings. It could be 2 sides of the great Leonardo, or it could be 2 different Leonardos. The other Leonardo is who I'd like to speak about for a few minutes. Leonardo Fibonacci di Pisa. I'm working with something called a Wacom tablet. I used to use overhead projectors, which made it much easier to draw and write. This is like writing with a crayon on a 2 centimeter square piece of glass. But I can watch what I write on the screen. Now, so this man was Leonardo Fibonacci di Pisa. They sometimes called him Pisano, which meant the person from Pisa, or Fibonacci literally means the son of the simpleton. Bonaccio is the simpleton, and Fibonacci makes him the son of the simpleton. His nickname in his own lifetime was Bigaloni, which means a blockhead. But on the social ladder, as a mathematician, he would have been well below the sorcerer. He was educated in northern Africa, where the Islamic scholars were far ahead of their European counterparts. He was educated at the University of Fez, the oldest university in the world. And he came back to his hometown, Pisa, at the very time the Leaning Tower was being built. And he wrote a book called the Liber Abaci, the book of the abacus. In the Liber Abaci, he first starts with, there are 13 chapters. He starts out with the question, he says, read this number. What is that number? Can anyone read it? Call it out if you. 98. 98. Then he says, try this number. This is now harder. LXLV111. Anyone read that? That's also 98. 50 is L, so 50 plus 10 less than the next 50. And he suggested writing 98 with two symbols like this. In fact, he introduced into Europe the following symbols. 1 dash vertical for 1, 2 horizontal dashes sort of lightly connected, 1, 2, 3 lightly connected, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you see the number of straight lines is proportional to the value of the symbol. 7 takes some imagination, but this is the way he introduced the 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The 8, he borrowed here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The 9 he borrowed from the Arabs, and the 0 he didn't borrow from the Arabs, but either he borrowed from the Hindustan, who had taught the Arabs the system, or he got it directly from either he borrowed it or he made it up. In any event, the Arabs make their numbers like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and a 0. So this is the Indo-Arabic system of numbers. The 0, which is absolutely essential to mathematics. You can't do calculus without the concept of nothing, was formalized by Aryabhata, the Indian astronomer, in 500, I believe, AD. The Europeans didn't know anything about it until the publication of the Liber Abaci. When calculus was formulated by Isaac Newton and later by Leibniz, of course, it was absolutely essential. Without 0, you can't do mathematics. The algebra of 0. Then, through the book, he did algebra problems. Whenever you see a word with al in it, al means the, so algebra, alcohol, alchemy are all Arabic words. Alimony is not. That's American. That comes from Los Angeles, actually. It was all through the book, he did the algebra that Omar Khayyam had really given to the West. It was the 13th chapter that was most interesting. In the 13th chapter, he proposed that in a room like this, there's one pair of rabbits, and the pair of rabbits are going to reproduce according to certain rules. So in January, the first month, there's one pair of rabbits. They have to mature for 2 months before they can give rise to new rabbits. And then after the 2 months, they give rise, and the others have to wait for 2 months also, but they keep going. So in January and February, there's the original pair of rabbits. I'll give them 1 ear. They're now 1 month mature. In March, here's the original pair, 1 new pair. In April, the 4th month, here's the original pair, 1 new pair. This pair gains an ear. In May, here's the original pair, 1 new pair. This pair gains an ear. This pair gains a second ear and reproduces. You see how it works. It's all in the ears. In June, the original pair, 1 new pair. This pair gains an ear. This pair gains a second ear and reproduces. This pair is already mature. They come down and reproduce. This pair gains an ear. In June, the 6th month, there should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pairs of rabbits. And his question became, is there a way to estimate or predict how many rabbits there'd be at the end of the year, the end of 2 years, without drawing all these ears. And then he realized what he had here was 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. What's the next one? 13. Next?
31.
No. 34. 55. 89. 144. 233. 377. 610. 987. 1597, etc. It's getting more difficult. 2584. What's the algorithm I'm using? Adding the last two, of course, to get the next. What mathematicians would say, a sub n minus 1 plus a sub n equals a sub n plus 1, like this. What he didn't realize is these are nature's numbers. The numbers nature likes the best. For example, if I draw a pine cone, it looks like a cone like this, and then there are spirals made by the scales. I can count them in one direction and count them in the other, and they'll always come out to be 13 and 8. You can also look at the bottom of the pine cone, and you'll see the same clockwise and counterclockwise, like this. It'll always be 13 and 8. That's called the phyllotaxy of the pine cone. If I were doing a chrysanthemum or a daisy, here's the head of the plant, here are the petals. I should have drawn that larger, but if you see the spirals going clockwise and then spirals going counterclockwise, you'll find that there are 34 in one direction, 21 in the other. Always pairs of Fibonacci numbers in sequence like this. You see, if this had been a sunflower, it would be 55 in one direction, 34 in the other. But in some species of sunflower, it's 89 in one direction, 55 in the other. In every instance, the phyllotaxy is a pair of Fibonacci numbers in sequence. You see? If I draw a tree, let me write a few of these again. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. If I draw a tree, or if I paint a tree, here's the trunk of the tree. At one point, the tree branches like this. And then, at this level, it might branch again. But if this one branches, this will not. You do the bottom a little bit. There are the roots of the tree. At this point, this might branch. But if this one branches, this will not. It'll just keep going. But this will branch, like this. The next time, one of these will branch. This will not. This will branch. One of these two will branch, but this will not. I'm right-handed. When I draw, I shade this way. I put the heel of my hand down and I make swiping lines. A left-hander would make lines like this. This is how we know Leonardo is without a doubt left-handed. All his drawings have the negative slope versus the positive slope. So if with the right-handed slope, let's say the light is coming this way, I make the left side of the tree a little bit darker, like this. There's an easy way to remember. In the United States, this would make sense if I were to tell people that I'm wearing a European tie. This is an American tie. It has negative slope. This is a European tie. In fact, the rest of the world uses positive slopes in the ties. Americans use negative slopes. Now, it turns out it's back in the 1920s when Brooks Brothers, a very famous haberdasher in New York, started making English-style ties. They said, we're not doing anything the British are doing, so they chose the other direction. And with the British, it was flowing from the heart down. That made it a positive slope like this, see? In any event, maybe when I gave you a chance to think about it, you would have noticed. Have you noticed? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3 branches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. No self-respecting artist really goes around counting branches. Leonardo did. Leonardo was a scientist doing art, and he was absolutely compelled about learning from nature. His whole life he always wrote and admonished his students, don't learn from each other, learn from nature. But we, in turn, learn from him to learn from nature. Let me do a couple of more things with this. With this series, if I had gone a little higher, let's see, 21, 34, 55, 89, 144, etc., 233, I divide the numbers by each other. The second by the first, the ratio is 1. The third by the second, the ratio is 2. The third by the, fourth by the third, the ratio is 1.5. 5 divided by 3 is 1.666, repeating. 8 divided by 5 is 1.60, ad infinitum. As you go up, you'll eventually get to 1.618, to 6 places, 0, 3, 4. It comes from the Fibonacci sequence, or the Fibonacci series of numbers, and we call it phi, or phi. It's the golden ratio. It first appeared in 1202 in the book by Fibonacci. Then, as we looked at architecture and art, we found that the Greeks had discovered it almost 2,000 years earlier. The Pythagoreans. Pythagoras was a mathematician who came from the island of Samos, just off the western coast of Turkey. He was educated in Miletus, where the first Academy of Science was born, where science was born. He received postgraduate education in Babylon. Then he went to Italy, and in southern Italy he established his own academy, the Pythagoreans, where they studied music and mathematics. It is a construction, a geometric construction like this. He takes a square, obviously a 1 by 1. He divides the square, he bisects it with a vertical line, then he puts a compass right here and the pen of the compass right here. So he makes an arc like this. Finally, he extends the horizontal line at the top until it intersects the arc. He drops a vertical line like this and completes the rectangle. Now this is around the 5th century BC. The 6th century BC, 2,500 years ago, long, long before Fibonacci. Then he makes the calculation. If this is 1, this is 0.5, this is 0.5. According to the Pythagorean theorem, you can calculate this distance, the radius of the arc, as 1.25. The square of 1 plus the square of 0.5, which happens to be 1.118 8.034. That's what this distance is. Of course, there's a 0.5 over here. So he adds that 0.5 and gets 1.618034. So long before Fibonacci, the Pythagoreans were creating the golden ratio or the golden rectangle. Within a century, it became so important, in fact, that they started making, let me try to draw a better golden rectangle. This is the golden rectangle. You take the square, bisect it. This is the radius of an arc like this. You complete the golden rectangle. The Greeks started building their temples inscribed in these golden rectangles. It's very difficult drawing with these pens because you can't look down. It's black on black. There are 3 steps at the bottom. And there are 8 columns. It's known as the most beautiful extrovert building ever built. Extrovert because the Greeks didn't know how to span large distances. They didn't have steel. They made these columns, the fluted columns, 3 like this. The person who designed it was Phidias, the great architect and sculptor. As a sculptor, he was even greater. With his assistants Callicratus and Ictinus, he knew, for example, that a perfectly straight line like this on the horizon will look like it's sagging, because the horizon itself is like this. So if you have a perfectly straight rope, a tight rope, it'll look like it's sagging against this horizon, which looks straight. So he contrived to make the curvature of the base about 5 kilometers. He contrived to make these columns meet in the air at roughly 2.2 kilometers, like this. So the lines look exactly right, but there's nothing straight about them. They look exactly straight, they don't look, even though they're not straight. So it's optical illusions defeating disparaging optical illusions. Then Phidias came back and carved the most magnificent statuary for the British Museum. Has anyone seen the Alger marbles? They really should be back in Greece on the Parthenon. The system was used by the Romans, but then forgotten. 1,500 years later, it was revived. It was invented anew. Here's their imagine 100 centimeter panel that happens to be 162 centimeters long. You draw the diagonals of the square. You draw the diagonals of the rectangle. Like this. Sorry about that. And the head goes right there. That's the hot spot, the golden spot on the entire panel. That's the where the face is going to go. Now, there must be many artists in this room, but there are certain formulas that you may remember. The eyes go on the equator, like this. As a matter of fact, until we're 9 or 10 years old, I'm told, we all improve our drafting ability. And then some metamorphosis takes place. 19 out of 20 people, that's 95%, start going backwards. They regress. They start putting the eyes higher and higher on the head. 5% keeps looking at the subject. They're the ones we call the artistic ones that have some drafting ability. You divide this distance into 5. The eyes go in the second. and the fourth fifth, like this. The width of the mouth is the distance between the pupils. The proportion recurs over and over. But Leonardo was much, much too good to paint the face straight on. There's a dynamic effect here. First, he organizes the entire subject in a golden triangle. A golden triangle can be achieved by drawing a star like this. This angle is 36 degrees. This angle and this angle are 72 degrees each. That's what organizes the Mona Lisa. Again, he's so good. He makes sure that the face is turned slightly this way, the body is turned slightly the other way. But most importantly, it's the mouth. There's an optical illusion in the mouth. Now, what I'm going to do is go to the slides. But before I do that, let me just mention one last thing, since there are so many artists here. Draw an x-axis and mark this off as 1 unit. There it's about, oh, I don't know, maybe 30 centimeters, 40 centimeters. Now, contract this distance to 62%. This is 50%. This is 62%. Check it off here. Now take 62% of this, which would be about here. Take 62% of this, and keep going like this. When you connect the locus of points, you get this spiral. It's called a logarithmic spiral in mathematics. There are many kinds of spirals. Here's a spiral called an Archimedean spiral. It's tightly wound. That's toilet paper. Nature doesn't like this kind of Archimedean spiral. It likes this type of spiral. In fact, there are creatures that inhabit these shells. The logarithmic spiral is also seen in vortices of water going down in the ocean, in hurricanes. It's seen in the horns of a ram, in the claws of a cat. The equation for mathematicians in the room, here it would be a very simple, in polar coordinates, r equals c times theta for this. For this, it's much more complicated. It looks like this. E to the minus natural log of phi divided by pi over 2 radians times theta. Nature had to solve a lot of differential equations to generate the spiral, but this is the spiral it likes. What Leonardo saw was these spirals appear everywhere, especially in water going down tubes. And then he noticed that it also happens in curly hair. Curly hair is not an Archimedean spiral, but a spiral like this. So you can always recognize a Leonardo painting by the shape of those spirals. I will go to the slides now, otherwise this will go on till tomorrow. We all know some very bright people. This is a gallery, there's the academic part of the gallery. Here you'll find many, many bright people. In the sciences and mathematics, you frequently find very bright people. Among Indians, there was Srinivasa Ramanujan, the great mathematician early in the century. There's Bose, who collaborated with Einstein and generated Bose-Einstein statistics. There was Raman, who won a Nobel Prize in spectroscopy, and then his nephew, Chandrasekhar, who won a Nobel Prize for black holes. He was sailing with a steamship from Bombay to England. He was going to do graduate work at Cambridge University, and there on the steamship he thought about how gravitation can cause stars to implode if there's enough mass. His advisor at Cambridge thought this was nonsense, but initially he gave him some lip service. He said, that's fine, give a lecture on it at the symposium, but then he made fun of him Well, of course, Chandrasekhar went on to win the Nobel Prize, one of the truly great theoretical physicists of the 20th century. But there's a difference between the ordinary genius and the transformative genius. We know ordinary geniuses. Nobel Prize winners, I've known 22 of them, I counted recently. Most of them are very bright and very lucky. They have good advisors, good problems. Their advisors have given them good problems to solve, and they're truly gifted people. None of them are truly transformative. Once in a while you get a transformative genius that defines an entire field. You never ask the question, who was the greatest writer? You start ranking at number 2. In English, the greatest writer is obviously Shakespeare, and it could be Milton, who is number 2, or one of the great romantic poets. In the arts, it would be Leonardo and Michelangelo. You start at number 3. This is Western art. You start at ranking at number 3. It could be Rembrandt or Raphael, but number 1 and number 2, Leonardo gets it on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and Michelangelo on the other Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. As drivers, they're that significant. Michelangelo lived to be 89 years old. He was prolific. He produced so quickly and so magnificently, and he did architecture on the side. Leonardo, maybe the greatest artist of all, produced all of a dozen paintings. He might have touched as many as 17 panels, not canvases, panels, but all we have left of him are a dozen paintings. And of these dozen, only half a dozen are 100% by him. The others have been touched up by others, or he was finishing them for others. Art historians sometimes say it was too easy for him. Painting was too easy. I don't think so. What he would do is go off and do science and then come back, and instead of being rusty, he'd be far, far ahead with the psychological paintings that he was doing. This is Mrs. Nehru, senior Mrs. Nehru. Anilji sent me the image a couple of years ago, and she's looking at my book. The National Geographic that published the book was really excited about this picture. These are my 6 grandchildren, and the one in the middle is Delilah. Now, she's the one who observed at 5 that I was nice to people and I could draw. It was last year on July the 1st, I had just announced to them that I was no longer gainfully employed. I had just retired. They all got clustered around to find out what that meant. But a dog appeared, and I was history. They had all forgotten, except Delilah. Well, now they have a dog, the 4 children. That's the youngest of the 6, this one. They have their own golden retriever. This book came out as, it was supposed to come out as the 2 Leonardos. When I first gave the manuscript to the Smithsonian, the editors said it's a great title, we'll go with the 2 Leonardos. Halfway through the book, they came back and said to me, it's 95% one Leonardo and only 5% the other man. Can you think of another name with maybe a possessive in the title? There was a book out called Galileo's Daughter, and they wanted me to have a possessive. And I said, sure, what about Leonardo's model? The scientists would be happy with that because we work with models, mathematical models. And on the other hand, it could be the woman who sat for the most famous painting in the world. The publisher said, great, we'll go with that. When the book was finally finished, 13 chapters, the editors called me in again. They said, we don't think it's going to sell with this name. We think you should change the name. I said, but we've used Leonardo's model all through the book. They said, well, what do you think of Math and the Mona Lisa? I hemmed and hawed, but then it sounded, there was nice alliteration, and there was the chance to put the most famous painting on the cover. I said, I guess it'll work. The publisher, the editor, pulled out the cover. It had already been printed. They know much better than the authors about these things. it has multiplied, like Fibonacci's rabbits. These are the covers of the book in different languages. 2 of those don't belong. Anyone want to take a guess? This one? And this belongs. This is the Polish edition. It looks like a Picasso version of the Mona Lisa. This one doesn't belong because it's a repeat of this. Here's the Chinese edition from Taiwan. Here's the Chinese edition from Beijing, etc. So they know much better, the marketing department, than this is an early laptop. Are there any Macintosh users in this room? I see a few hands. Well, I prefer a Macintosh, and when I first started getting some royalties from Math and the Mona Lisa, I invested in this large 17-inch laptop, a G4, and a friend of mine sent me an essay by Umberto Eco, the Italian writer, who says, the Macintoshes are the Catholics of the computer world, and the PCs are the Protestants. They can interpret things any way they want. Well, I immediately sent the essay to a Nobel Prize winner, Bill Phillips, who I knew very well, used a Macintosh, and he fired back. He said, when the girls went away to university, we sat them down and we admonished them. Date within the religion. Stay away from PC users. This is in Turkey. This is what I mean by how the Parthenon would have looked if the lines were exactly straight. It's been amplified. It wouldn't have looked this bad. It's been amplified, and this is not quite the way we would see it, but it emphasizes how the curvature should be. It's a convex curvature. This is what the Parthenon looks like. It has no straight lines. You come and look at it from the side, and then you can see the hump in the middle and the convex curvature. I was there with a dean once from Virginia, from the United States, and it was the end of the day. They were just about to close the Acropolis down for the day. He bent over to tie his shoelaces. When he stood up, he was ashen white. He was pale. And I said, "Oh my word, are you sick?" I said. And he said, "No, I stole a piece of the Parthenon. If they see me, I'll get arrested, and I'll go off to prison." Well, we started walking off the Acropolis when all of a sudden a truck appeared and dumped tons of stones for the next day. So they were prepared for little stones being... Now, using this Macintosh, I calculated, or rather programmed, these polyhedra. There are 5 regular polyhedra according to the Pythagoreans. All the sides are the same. The angle at the vertices, the angles are the same. That's what a regular polyhedron is. The tetrahedron, the octahedron, the icosahedron, the cube. According to the ancient Greeks, the Pythagoreans, these were the shapes of the atoms. In different admixtures, you could get everything else. You could get iron, you could get wood. This, however, was a standout. It was beyond the 4 elements, the 4 atoms. It was the shape of the universe, and it was a cult figure they never wanted to divulge. Again, using the Macintosh, I made stellated icosahedron. This is the truncated icosahedron, otherwise a football. If you paint these hexagons white and the pentagons black. But of course, this is using a computer. This is Leonardo 500 years ago, without a Macintosh. He illustrated a book called the Divina Proporzione, or the Divine Proportion. And he invented the idea of these transparent figures where you could see through them and see how the various sides, the legs are connected. In the 19th century, Gustav Fechner, cut rectangles in different proportions and had people choose the one they liked the best. 1 means a square. The ratio of the length to width is 1. 1.20 means it's 20% longer than it is wide. The people chose in 35% of the population, 1.62. We clearly have an affinity for the ratio. The first Nobel Prize in physics went to Wilhelm Röntgen, who, of course, made the X-ray machine, the X-ray tube. He saw that he could see right through flesh, and bones showed up as translucent or opaque. But then, if you measure the metacarpal AB divided by, here, AB divided by BC, BC divided by CD, CD divided by DE is always 1.618. The proportions in the bones are all golden ratios. Le Corbusier, who designed Chandigarh, came up with this modular man. I believe this particular poster, the original, hangs in Switzerland, but it shows, it's stylized, but the height of the man divided by the height of the navel is 1.618. This distance from the navel to the head divided by the distance from the elbow to the tip of the finger is again 1.618. And he used this idea in building buildings themselves and cities. So Chandigarh apparently is based on the repetition of the golden ratio. He was, of course, I got this from Time Magazine's website with Jawaharlal Nehru. He did like to hobnob with the greats, including Albert Einstein. He went to Princeton to meet him. He was inspired by the Roman architect Vitruvius, by Leonardo's famous drawing, The Vitruvian Man, and by an art writer of the 15th century. If you go to Italy, if you go to Europe, you find that on the euro, one side is the same everywhere, but then it differs on the other side, country to country. This is the Italian euro. In the Italian euro, it's the Vitruvian Man. In the Austrian euro, it's Mozart. This is Florence of the early 16th century. Florence, of course, was a city-state, and like the other little city-states, Siena, Pisa, Milano, each time Florence got into a skirmish and came out victorious, or at least survived, it commissioned a statue of David. It was the little kid on the block. Goliath, the big kid, was always harassing him. Each time it survived, David was commissioned. This is by Donatello, one of the most famous bronzes from the Renaissance. This is from Verrocchio. Verrocchio was Leonardo's boss, the man who influenced him more than anyone else. The statue was made around 1471. This is about 5 feet high. Then the statue itself is 5 feet high, so the head is at 10 feet. This is Verrocchio's David. It became a competition in space and time because for the next 50 years or 60 years or so, there were 3 Davids commissioned. When this one was created, the contest was over. Michelangelo's David is surpassing. But it's the second David I'm most interested in. It was 2 years ago. My wife and I were in the Bargello Museum in Florence, and I had the permission of the director to take pictures, close-up pictures of the statue, which is normally not allowed. So I put my camera on a tripod, and I held the tripod at full arm's length to get this shot. Now look at this profile. And this is Leonardo in his 60s. You're looking at the transformative genius as a teenager. Look at the shape of the nose, the eyebrows. Absolutely compelling. The director of the National Gallery in Washington first told me about this resemblance, and I had to find out for myself. And sure enough, this really is compelling evidence. Verrocchio had a commission to paint this large painting, the Baptism of Christ. He was a much better sculptor than he was a painter. He painted Christ and John the Baptist, and then he got his two young assistants. This was the two to paint the angels. The painter of this is either De Credi or Botticelli. This is Leonardo. And this turned out to be a strategic mistake for Verrocchio, because once he saw Leonardo's angel, he never took up the brush again. It's a genius meeting a transformative genius. It's just like Isaac Newton, when he went home for a year and a half during the bubonic plague that was ravaging England. He had a very hard think. He came back with a list of his mental inventions. That's what he termed them. He had invented essentially calculus and the laws the laws we know as Newton's laws, the universal law of gravitation. His boss, the great Isaac Barrow, also resigned immediately and became a preacher. It's a genius meeting a transformative genius. You can see from the hair when you're close up. In fact, you go from the Botticelli room in the Uffizi to the Leonardo room, where just 2.5 paintings stand. 2.5 because this is obviously only half of Leonardo. Well, you're at eye level with this angel, and you see those curls, you see this incredible visage, and you know that this is no ordinary artist painting it. At 19, he oversaw the placing of this 2-meter diameter gilded ball on top of Brunelleschi's dome. And this awakened in him a lifelong love of gadgetry and engineering. In 1478, he wrote to the Milanese from Florence. In the letter he says, he's writing from left to right here. Very, very rare, but he's applying for a job. And he says, I can build cannons that can breach any wall. I can build walls that no cannonball can breach. I can make portable bridges. I can make tanks. He was applying as a military engineer. The last 3 words are, I also paint. So Leonardo also paints. He got the job. Occasionally he painted, but most of the time he was doing inventions. He worked in this castle. This is the Sforza Castle in Milan. And his drawings of gadgets, this is the side wheeler. You can see the negative slope in the drawing. And the exploded view of machine parts, gears. It's absolutely astonishing 500 years ago that he could envision these. The automatic transmission, 400 years before cars were made, and the odometer. This is an odometer. It looks like a wheelbarrow. You take it for a walk. Every time this wheel turns 30 times, this one turns once. Every time this one turns 30 times, this one turns once. So 30 times 30 times 30, 27,000 times, and a ball falls into the box. Then you count the balls and you tell how far around the city walls is. For a very long time, this was thought to be a spring-driven car. It turns out to be robotics. He invented the field of robotics. This is the replicated version of the robotic car and the robotic knight. It would stand up and open its chest and pull out a bouquet of flowers to give to Mrs. Sforza. More than anything else, he wanted to know how humans could fly. He said, if birds can fly, humans should fly. He sketched reams and reams of notebooks, papers, with the motion of wings in dynamic motion like this. He knew exactly the design, not just the design, but the way the wing had to move. And we call this preternatural vision. There was a baseball player in America who used to insist a baseball approaching him at 160 kilometers per hour, he could read the names and see the seams on it. This is preternatural vision. I asked a Harvard neurologist once if this was possible physiologically, and he said he suspected 2010 vision, so they focused much earlier. But there were obviously things that he was gifted in, physically gifted. Well, these are ornithopter wings that people would have to strap on, and obviously we couldn't have generated the energy, the force to take off. You can imagine his assistants coming to work and being told that they were going to test fly. Then here he designed the helicopter, and in the 20th century it inspired Sikorsky, who invented the helicopter. And in case that broke, this is the evolution of the bicycle in the 19th century. The date I see here is 1818. A man would take a pair of wheels for a walk. Then the unicycle balanced with small wheels in the back, in the front. By 1895, a pair of equal-sized wheels, a chain drive, large gear, small gear for mechanical advantage, handlebar. This is how bicycles evolved during the 19th century. One of my students owned this bike. She showed me. It's a Trek 6, which makes it $6,000. But you can lift it with a finger. Leonardo's design, left-handed of course, shading of the sprockets, the gears, and the bicycle, 500 years ago. Although there's some controversy about this because this was found in the Codex Madrid, which was uncovered in Madrid in 1963, and the discoverer of the drawing laminated it in plastic, so we can't get to it to date the ink. So it could very well be Leonardo. It's not a good sketch, but nothing can surprise you when you see Leonardo's notes. Of course, the other Leonardo, Fibonacci, lived when this building was being erected. A student sent this to me once. I saved some money on the footings, but don't worry, no one will ever notice. Well, a few people noticed. Leonardo and Galileo both noticed. Leonardo made experiments with falling bodies. He didn't go to Pisa to do this. He would have been in danger if he went to Pisa. Galileo lived in Pisa 110, 120 years later. Both of them came up with the law of free fall, that objects independent of their masses fall at the same rate. In other words, they were divorcing air resistance from the falling body problem, and Galileo gets full credit because he published his results. The trajectories of projectiles, as engineers thought they were, Galileo showed these were parabolic around 1610. 1490s, Leonardo showed that trajectories were in fact all parabolas. In the hands of Isaac Newton, they become parts of ellipses, and Newton calculated how you can orbit the Earth, how you can escape the Earth. 300 years before Armstrong and Aldrin went to the moon, this was all calculated in the Principia. Galileo's telescope, 1609. Isaac Newton invented the reflecting telescope. No lenses, but mirrors, far more powerful for the same size. The Hubble telescope, which is a reflecting telescope. This is Leonardo's telescope of 1490. He's constantly prefiguring the great scientists of the distant times. Among all the sciences, however, he was most interested in anatomical drawings. He's called the most relentlessly curious man in history. The left-handed shading, all the notes written from right to left, the details of the cardiovascular system. In his time, the physicians were still depicting human organs that were easily mistakable for the organs of a frog. And here, of course, the details are so compelling. This particular drawing is quite interesting. He visits the hospital and he meets an old man. He asks the man, he says, "How old are you?" And the man says, "I don't know, but I'm very old." Leonardo says, "I don't know how old I am, but my grandson is 58. Well, Leonardo must have estimated the man to be over 100, but suddenly, with a smile on his face, passes away. Leonardo, the most relentlessly curious man, wants to know how anyone can die such a sweet death. He writes, "I did an anatomy of him right away." A few weeks later, he does an anatomy of a child, and he says, in the case of the child, the vessels leading to the heart were clear and supple. In the case of the old man, they were occluded and brittle. He's talking about atherosclerosis, or hardening of the arteries, 500 years ago, 400 years before Viennese surgeons first described it scientifically. His drawing of the human heart, many of the best anatomical drawings are in Windsor Castle. They're the Queen's collection. There's a Cambridge University surgeon who does mitral valve surgery using Leonardo's own advice. My son is a cardiac radiologist, and he did that. He doesn't tell me who, he won't tell me who the patient was, but he did study me at one point, I know. So that could be my own heart. He gave it to me in a CAT scan film version, so I could rotate it until I got it to just the right configuration. This is the way he wrote. It's hard to read. This is called the Da Vinci font. Nature being inconstant and taking pleasure in creating and continually producing new forms. He's talking about evolution. 350 years before Darwin, he talked about evolution. There's the story in Turkey, the legend, that in 1480, the conqueror of Istanbul, old Constantinople, invented Leonardo to come and do a portrait and to work as a military engineer. Leonardo had just accepted a job with the Sforzas and he couldn't go, so Gentile Bellini went to Turkey and painted this famous portrait of Mehmet the Conqueror. 20 years later, Leonardo was out of a job in Milan when the French invaded. So Leonardo, applying for a job, wrote this letter. The letter was found in 1950 in the archives, the Ottoman archives. It's written from right to left in old Ottoman form. Leonardo says, "I can build cannons that can breach any wall. I can make walls that no cannonball can breach. I can make portable bridges." Down here he says, "I also paint." But the most interesting is right here. What he proposes is a bridge over the Golden Horn in Istanbul. Istanbul has the Bosphorus, which is very wide. It's a mile wide. But then there's an inlet 240 meters wide called the Golden Horn. The scribe who gave this to the emperor, to the sultan, wrote on the side, there's this infidel who wants to come and show us how to build bridges and cannons. So the universal genius wasn't recognized. He didn't get the job, but these are the drawings he made for the bridge. It looks like a structure with swallowtails, and from the side, the silhouette, slender, graceful silhouette. The bridge finally got built 500 years later in Norway, on the road between Oslo and Bergen. It has parabolic supports underneath, and this is the roadway. Now it's being built in Istanbul, 500 years too late. And there's an Indian composer my wife and I know very well called Daniel Nazareth. He trained with von Karajan in Berlin. He was the conductor of the Leipzig Gewandhaus, and he now lives in New York. And recently he composed an opera called Leonardo's Bridge. It's going to be premiered in Istanbul next year. We're hoping on April the 15th. the birthday, and they're trying to get Placido Domingo as the lead, as Leonardo. Oh, we were in the Hermitage in Russia just a couple of weeks ago. This is a Leonardo Madonna and Child painting. Now, a principle that was discovered in 1998, this particular picture in black and white appeared in the front page of the New York Times. An Englishman by the name of Christopher Tyler discovered it. He said he was studying patients whose right and left hemispheres had been surgically separated. This is sometimes done in order to overcome epilepsy. Well, he said he had something like 20 patients. He took his art books, and with all the portraits, he drew a line down the center. He was going to have the patient look at the right and left side separately. And to his astonishment, he found that the line passed right through an eye. Always one eye. The gifted artist somehow gravitates to this. And if you look at your own photographs that you've taken of single subjects, this is in the Hermitage. I took this picture 20 years ago. Rembrandt's Old Rabbi, right through the eye. And a great painter can put more life into his subject than these haggard tourists. Right through the eye. When my son graduated from medical school, I apparently took that picture. I had to check it out, right through the eye. Here, it's not the central line at all that goes through the eye. This is a painting of John F. Kennedy, JFK, done posthumously by Jamie Wyeth. But when I saw this, I was immediately intrigued. I pulled out my ruler and measured the right and left side. It turns out this is 1 part to 0.618. Jamie Wyeth, who knows no mathematics, the artist, had inadvertently put Kennedy's eye on at this distance. It's really to show that he's sequestered in his own thoughts. He's isolated. I wrote to Jamie Wyeth and asked if I could use this in my book, Math and the Mona Lisa. And he gave me permission, and he said, this is a fascinating principle. He didn't know he had done this. Because you see, we see this in nature, and it becomes a subliminal message for us. We know what's right. We know what's wrong this way. He also asked if he could do anything more, and I said, you can write a paragraph for the back of the book. So he wrote one of the paragraphs for the back. But he wrote to me separately and said, I love chapter 8. That's the one he appears in. Now, the other principle that was discovered a year later, 1999, Christopher Tyler, the Englishman, discovered that central line principle, and Mike Nichols of Australia discovered another principle. For 100 years or so, we've known that there's a preponderance of left cheeks over right cheeks. The sitter sits with the left cheek like this, more than with the right cheek. And what Mike Nichols wanted to know was, is it the artist deciding, or is it the painter or the subject deciding? So he took a large group, 400 students, I think that's about the number here today, 400 people, and he said, we're going to do a portrait of you. This portrait is going to hang. He stopped there. He let half of the group out. He said, this portrait is going to hang in your mother's house or in your girlfriend's or your boyfriend's house. Immediately, it became the left cheek. People turned their face to make the left cheek more prominent. Then he went to the other group and he said, the portrait that we do of you is going to hang next to Albert Einstein. Well, Albert Einstein is a certified genius, so everyone immediately turned the other way, the right cheek. The question was, why do we behave this way? And the boys and girls, the men and women in the room, behaved exactly the same. The psychologists explain it with very simple models. They say, we emote on the right side. That's where we do art mostly. We do mathematics on the left side. In the case of, if you want to be endearing, your left brain, which controls your right brain, which controls the left cheek, becomes more dominant. You see? You turn this way. Albert Einstein had especially a large portion of this region called the inferior parietal lobe. It's one of the few brains we have of a transformative genius. He died in 1955, and a young pathologist saved his brain. The physicists at the Institute for Advanced Study were indignant. They said Einstein willed himself to be cremated and his ashes to be sown somewhere unknown. But the family said, well, if it's for science, let him keep it. The young pathologist, Thomas Harvey, lost his job, but he went back to his hometown of Kentucky, home state, and for 40 years, the jar with Einstein's brain in it stayed on his bookshelf, most of the time behind some books. When the news came out that the brain was around, immediately universities, Berkeley, McGill, McMaster in Canada, asked for slices and photographs of the brain. And they found, among other things, that Einstein was missing the parietal operculum in the back, where you have speech. The inferior parietal lobe, where you do mathematics, had grown into that region. So he had a large portion of that, about 20% more than average people. So maybe he really was wired for human genius. Now, I mentioned that Leonardo painted only a dozen paintings. Rembrandt painted himself 97 times. It's a magnificent diary of his evolution, of his aging process. This is a sampling of the 97. These are mostly 5-to-1 right cheeks, one left cheek, until you realize these are self-portraits. When you look in a mirror, it's reversed. So he was trying to be endearing also, not to impress with his intelligence. These are a couple Leonardo's version of the rocks paintings in the Louvre and in a second version in England. These two portraits, Diwan Mana very kindly produced on these posters, are two of Leonardo's three girls. They're called the three girls or the three sisters. This one is in Washington. She's the ugly duckling sister of the three. It's a square, and they've used computers to produce hands for her from sketches Leonardo left that reside in Windsor Palace. This one, the lady with an ermine, is in Krakow, Poland. I think it's the most beautiful of the three paintings. In 1992, when it was the 500th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of the New World, the United States wanted to borrow this painting from the Poles. And the Polish government immediately said, the lady is too fragile to travel. Well, three conservators and curators from the National Gallery in Washington journeyed to Krakow to check the painting out. They showed that the painting was actually in very good shape, that the background black had been painted later on, most likely by Delacroix. But the most interesting thing of all, in the neck right here were Leonardo's fingerprints. The same fingerprints were right there and here in the bushes. What Leonardo was doing was velatura. He would put paint, raw paint on the board, then he would mix with his fingers, always leaving his fingerprints. Well, the Poles were really impressed by that, but they said the lady still doesn't travel. Fortunately for the United States, Lech Walesa travels, and he was visiting the United States, sitting in the back seat of a limousine with George Herbert Bush, the father, who asked him if we could borrow the painting. Lech Walesa knew immediately what the painting was. But he was from another city, not Krakow, from Gdansk, and he said, sure, why not? So the painting came to the United States and was hung for 8 weeks in the National Gallery. And they didn't have the proper cameras to photograph the fingerprints, so they called the FBI in. And the FBI photographed the fingerprints. Leonardo is now on file. In this, the Ginevra, the Washington, D.C.'s version, you can see the fingerprints right there. This painting was sold for £20,000 in 1990. It was known to be a high Renaissance portrait. There was really no suspicion of who it might have been, although I think an expert could have seen by the hairdressing and by the dress here that this was suspicious. This could have been a Leonardo. But then the fingerprints were found right here in the upper corner. The price of the painting went from £20,000 in 1990 to £200 million 3 years ago. A new Russian offered the money immediately. The new Russians, you know, are these people who made a lot of money after the breakup. We're down to the very end. Very quickly, let me just tell you that only when you look at the painting close up will you see this. If you look at the mouth, the smile disappears. If you look away a few degrees, 5 degrees on each side, and look slightly askance at the mouth, the smile comes back. It's an optical illusion. Margaret Livingston at Harvard proved this with a series of constructions. Did Leonardo do it on purpose? I don't think there's ever an accident with Leonardo. One thing here, the background was always thought to be a figment of Leonardo's imagination. This bridge here and these rocks here, they turn out to be the Valdano rocks in not too far from Florence, in a place called Arezzo, and there's the bridge, Ponte Bruiano. Okay, in 1911, the world's most famous painting was stolen when a Florentine national working in the Louvre walked out with it. He was working as a custodian, and this Paris magazine shows him taking the painting down, puts it under his, it's a small painting, puts it under his trench coat and walks right across the courtyard. For a whole year, the painting, almost 2 years, the painting was under Vincenzo Perugia's bed. But then he tried to sell it, and the person he asked was Uffizi conservator who realized what it was. He was immediately arrested. The painting was returned to Florence after it was exhibited. But now, look who it inspired. Look at the clothes, the mustache. So Inspector Clouseau is Vincenzo Perugia. The Last Supper. This is my last picture. I've gone much, much too long. Leonardo painted this in the dining room, the refectory of a monastery in Milan. His boss, Sforza, Ludovico Sforza, must have asked him to do the portrait. Leonardo organizes the 12 apostles in 4 trios like this. Each of the disciples is known. Art historians recognize them. He had an easy time finding the models for most of them. He was like a Hollywood casting director. He knew the faces he wanted. The only 2 people he couldn't find a good model for was for Christ and for Judas. Now, in earlier paintings of Judas, they always have him seen from behind. You're not supposed to look into the eye of evil. But Leonardo puts him into the lineup because here is Christ about to announce, one of you is going to denounce me, but hasn't done it yet. See, or this is the very electric moment when it happens. There is Judas. You know, he has a shadow on his face, so you don't see him. He also has a beard, although the beard could have been painted later on, because we know from his sketches what the face looked like. But the story goes, Leonardo was having a hard time finding Judas after he had painted in Christ, and a friend came to him and said, I found your Judas, he's in a prison in Milan. Leonardo goes to the prison and finds the man, and the man agrees to pose for Judas. As Leonardo paints him into the Last Supper, the man says, you don't recognize me, do you? Leonardo suddenly recognizes him and starts trembling. This was his Jesus 3 years earlier. Now, like so many other stories like this, it could be a myth, but he nourished myth as much as anyone. This is the last picture now. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to try to answer some questions if there are some, and I'll be happy to sign some books if anyone's interested.
How we are bombarded with certain imagery today. Recently, apart from the usual circles of art, science, and all the contexts that we talked about, Leonardo da Vinci, he shot to fame and became a household name thanks to one Mr. Dan Brown and his famous book, Da Vinci Code. And through his book, he uses the character of a professor of Harvard to validate his beliefs. Right. And that's my first part of the question. What do you think about it? I mean, you mentioned the reverse. You gave the Thai example, the reverse strokes, how it is being used in the U.S. as compared to Europe. Right. And the driving system and this whole entire spirit of way beyond what is being done in Europe and trying to do something new. And the conspiracy theory, the certain formation in which the roads are constructed in DC, and all sorts of things. That is the first part of my question. What do you think about it?
Can you be a bit short?
Yeah, and quickly, the second part of the question is, are you part of any secret society?
In this business of writing about Leonardo and studying Leonardo, you essentially bask in the reflected glory. There's nothing more than that. The real genius of Leonardo is in those notebooks rather than, I shouldn't say rather than in the paintings, because the paintings are the most famous in the world after all. This part-time artist was possibly the greatest painter of all time. But he was quite simply the best in every field he dealt in of all time as well. So he's in this very small class. There are no secret societies. I know the church was shaken up very badly by what he said. In the book, Dan Brown talked about the secret code. The secret code is the Fibonacci numbers. They're simply taken out of context. I know I gave a talk at NASA in 1993 and then 2007, I guess, 2008. And I gave a talk in Israel at the Technion, and I showed how the Fibonacci series came about with the rabbits. There was a man in the audience, Mario Livio, an astrophysicist. He wrote a book called The Golden Ratio. And Dan Brown wrote about, he acknowledged Mario Livio. He said without that book, he couldn't have written his own. I'm very happy he wrote the book. I wake up each morning thinking of how turning the limelight on Leonardo helped the sale of my book, which became the second highest selling book on Leonardo, a distant second.
I would request Professor Goswami to share his thoughts. Although it was a bit reluctant, he said the lecture has gone very long and everybody has appreciated, and I would like to get to hear, but still, we would request a few words from you, Professor Goswami. Thank you so much.
Professor Atalay has not only taken us across a very long journey, very, very long and complicated and exciting journey, but also shared with us the fact that he knew Leonardo personally. Not that he was really born for 1456 or something like that, but he seems to have studied Leonardo in a manner which is perhaps completely unknown to me. I have benefited enormously. I have been excited by what he said. I have learned an enormous amount in the course of an hour and a quarter. And one can't be grateful enough for this experience. May I just take 2 or 3 more minutes? And this might interest Professor Atalay. Incidentally, I asked him when I was sitting next to him, where does the word Bulent come from? His name, first name, and is it related to Persian Buland? He says, yes, I think, I'm not sure, but my mother told me it means a pinnacle, right? So Bulandi and Bulantas are very closely related apparently, and I'm amazed at the prescience of his mother that she named him in this particular fashion, because he has reached a kind of a pinnacle of fame which is not very easy to come anywhere close to. But let me say, this extraordinary range of a man like Leonardo, this ability of a person to leap from mountaintop to mountaintop, as somebody said in the very beginning, this extraordinary capacity to comprehend the universe in its essence, so to speak, something which is so brilliantly reflected in his notebooks, is not given to many. Is not given to many at all. I mean, every time I hear the name Leonardo, every time I see a painting by him, every time I see a snippet of a notebook by him and so on, the wonderful words which I'll not take too long to recite, of a great poet like Fikr Tauswi come to my mind. What does he say? The state of mind of a genius. Mahsoos kiya maine sitaro ka tanaffus. मालूम किए मैंने बहारों के दफीने, बादल में लचकती हुई बूंदों को टटोला और रोके हैं बहकती हुई किरणों के सफीने. मैं चढ़ता ही चढ़ता गया इदराक के सीने, मैं बढ़ता ही बढ़ता गया कौनैन ब कौनैन, and so on. The state of mind. I was able to feel the breathing of the stars. I was able to see the texture of the little drops which were still forming before the rain fell down and so on. I was able to reach a place where everyone has been wondering, but I was able to reach the place where do the springs bring their great treasures down to the world and so on, so on. But अब कि मुझे लाया है वहाँ जाते हुए अयाम, जब मुझसे मेरा ज़हन संभाला नहीं, कांटा सा खटकता है ख्यालों की तहों में, जो इल्म की पोरों से निकाला नहीं जाता है, so on like that. Extraordinary minds with extraordinary reach and so on. They do appear from time to time. But I would like to mention just 1 or 2 things, Professor. Long years ago, I was teaching at the University of Princeton, and I was giving a course on iconometry, the measurement of icons. How do you measure icons in the Indian tradition? Is there a system? And in the 6th century AD, there was a great text which also acknowledged that to an earlier period and so on, called the Vishnu Dharmottaram, in which the measurements are given, micro measurements. The smallest unit of measurement, it says, is an anu, is an atom. 8 anus make a trasrenu, which is the size of a dust mote that you cannot even touch. 8 trasrenus make a balagra, which is the tip of a hair. 8 balagras make a leeksha, that is the egg of a louse. And multiply that by 8 and it becomes the size of a louse. And multiply that by 8 it becomes a yava, that is a barley grain and so on. And raise them one on top of the other, it becomes an angula, it becomes a digit. And that becomes the basis of all measurement in Indian archaeology. And there's a wonderful, extraordinary things in that. It says, for instance, the head has to have, is there 4 fingers like this, and so on. These are the ideal proportions which are recounted in that particular text. But one thing stuck in my mind, and that of a student who did his PhD eventually, called the measure of form. But he came to me with a question. He says the text says the height of a body is exactly as it is. This is just nonsense. I said, no, it isn't. If you spread your arms like this, from the tip of this middle finger of the right hand to the tip of the middle finger of the left hand, it is exactly the same proportion in an ideal human form. Vitruvius, Leonardo, 6th century person writing, an anonymous person writing in India. There are things to be discovered, things to be comprehended, amazing universes which in a certain sense begin to reveal themselves as we go deeper and deeper into this. Professor Atalay has put us in a debt of gratitude. Extraordinary mind that he has, extraordinary range that he has of not only knowledge and information but wisdom that we have shared. He has shared with us. And I'm deeply grateful that I get this opportunity, like the rest of you, to pay my respect to Professor Bulent Atalay for being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Goswami. As always, he always comes out with those pearls of wisdom, knowledge, information. Thank you once again. And most of all, I would like to thank all of you who says that we don't have discipline. If there is something with substance, with knowledge, with information, and done particularly the way Professor Atalay has done, we see pin drop silence, and no one has moved in spite of the lecture having gone beyond the time. Thank you so much once again. Keep supporting us, keep coming, and now I invite you all for a cup of tea outside. I'm sorry, Nitin, that I cut you short in between. I know that you had such wonderful questions in mind. If anybody else has questions in mind, Professor Atalay, after say about a gap of 15 to 20 minutes when he'll be interacting with the media over here, you are most welcome to ask questions and seek his answers there. Thank you once again, Mrs. Atalay. Thank you, Professor Goswami. Thank you, Mrs. and Mr. Nehru. Thank you, everybody.